so many of these kings who have great solid evidence that God exists and completely ignore it and go on and do really crazy things and may or may not be slightly insane. It makes it very difficult to take the stories literally as being actual truth rather than just some sort of metaphorical example of something. This week I have read chapters 3 to 5 of the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, and this is my summary, so now you don't have to read it. It's crazy. The daft keeps on dafting, so that's kind of going to be a theme. And there's a lot of stuff in this Daniel stuff, actually, that I think people will have generally heard of that I had no idea this is where it's from. We open anyway with King Nebuchadnezzar, who is still barking mad, and he builds this 90-foot gold statue of something, doesn't say what it's of, and decrees that when people hear some particular tinkly music played on a variety of different instruments, they have to bow down to this thing. The problem with this, of course, is that this story is about Daniel, and he's follower of God, so he's not allowed to bow down to 90-foot gold statues. So he's off in secret doing his private prayers to real God, and he gets dropped in it by some of Nebuchadnezzar's men who seem to be sort of jealous, I guess, or something of Daniel and his friends, that they're getting treated well by the king and they're very popular. It then gets kind of weird because they drop him in it to Nebuchadnezzar, who is then very angry about this and decides they are to be executed. Yeah, despite the fact this is the only guy who could actually translate his dreams, and he's 10 times more wise than the rest of all his magicians and that. So Nebuchadnezzar would seem to be barking mad, basically. The method of execution is people are to be thrown into a furnace and burned. Yeah. For some reason, Nebuchadnezzar is particularly angry about Daniel and his friends bowing down to this, so he orders that the fire is to be made 7 times hotter than normal, and obviously 7. Yeah, I don't know how you'd measure that. In those days, surely you can't make a fire that's 7 times hotter than a fire already. I guess he might have solved the nuclear fusion problem if that were true. But anyway, he declares that Daniel is to be dropped into this thing along with his 3 friends. It says that the fire is so hot that the soldiers who go to turf Daniel and co in there get burned themselves. So yeah, initially it looks like this is a problem for Daniel, except I already knew there's a story about Daniel in the lion's den, and that's after this. So it's a bit of a spoiler alert there, I suppose, that Daniel was going to be fine somehow. Nebuchadnezzar, anyway, looks into the furnace and just sees the 4 men walking around in it completely fine. And sort of, okay, this is a bit weird. So orders that they come out. And it even notes that they don't even smell a bit bonfire when they come out. That's a nice sort of touch. But I'm assuming this can't possibly be literal, just for the physics of trying to get a fire 7 times hotter than a fire. Don't know, maybe. But the idea that someone could come out of a fire and not smelling a bonfire is just ridiculous, frankly. Nebuchadnezzar, anyway, decides that it's so amazing that Daniel and his friends don't smell a bonfire, despite being in a furnace, that their God must be real, and therefore he acknowledges this and promotes Daniel and his friends. This is despite the fact that when he had his dream interpreted by Daniel, he'd already sort of promoted him and said, oh yes, God is real. He seems to have changed his mind or forgotten or something, hence it seems maybe Nebuchadnezzar is barking mad. As it then turns out, Nebuchadnezzar has another weird dream, so presumably, thanking his lucky stars, he actually let Daniel and the rock back out, because Daniel's the only one who can translate this. And it's something to do with a tree being cut back, but, very flowery and long-winded. Daniel comes along anyway and says that basically you're going to need to rein yourself in and start behaving yourself. Otherwise, you're going to lose your reign and it's all going to be a disaster. It seems that this goes okay for a little while, because it talks about a year later, Nebuchadnezzar is feeling particularly pleased with himself over something he's done. Crazy. And suddenly, the instant he does it, I can't remember what it was, but the instant he does it, a voice comes from heaven saying, that's it, you're done, your royal reign is over and you're going to be banished and you're going to have to eat grass until you mend your ways. This then happens, and Nebuchadnezzar does go off and eat grass for a bit. But he does then acknowledge that God is God, despite the fact he did that a year ago, and he is allowed to come back. And it says that his sanity is restored, which is interesting. It's almost like suggesting that sanity is a hurdle to belief. That's one of the things I've been particularly interested in. There was a bit that Glenn Scrivener said a while back about needing a childlike sense of awe in order to acknowledge God. And that being one of my problems. I don't really have that. I'm not in a weird, emotionless way or anything like that, but I'm just very pragmatic and practical, so I don't really have that to any significant degree. So, yeah, Nebuchadnezzar goes mad, it seems, then acknowledges God, gets his sanity back and his throne, and all seems well. It then randomly skips on to talk about Nebuchadnezzar's son being king, so I assume this is quite some time later. And he's having some sort of pagan party and having a wonderful time. But then suddenly a random hand or fingers, it talks about, appears and writes something on the wall in this party. I assume this is the origin of the writing being on the wall, which is quite interesting. Oh, what's his son called? Belshazzar is the new king, who's the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Lots of names. It says that Belshazzar is terrified of this writing on the wall, despite the fact he can't read it. But then, to be fair, if a hand appears and starts writing things on the wall, even if it does say, can you just bring a couple of mojitos down the hall for us, it's going to be pretty scary. So he sends for Daniel, who comes and translates this, and basically says that Belshazzar has been weighed and found wanting. Weighed and measured, I think, comes from a movie. But that's the origin of that. You've been weighed and you've been found wanting. That's clearly from here. And that his days are going to be up. It talks about basically implies, I think, that Persia is coming for his kingdom. It doesn't seem to happen straight away, but it does say that same night Belshazzar is killed. So, yeah. So many of these kings who have great solid evidence that God exists and completely ignore it and go on and do really crazy things and may or may not be slightly insane. It makes it very difficult to take the stories literally as being actual truth rather than just some sort of metaphorical example of something. And I suppose like this fire that's suddenly 7 times hotter than it was before. Right? If you can make it that hot, why would you not make it that hot? It's 7 times. I mean, 7's obviously a key biblical number, but it doesn't seem to make any real sense. So it just screams hyperbole. But yeah, that's a pretty significant dodging of death there. I mean, it's a bit nuts. I don't know why it is that I must be from Sunday school. I heard the story of Daniel and the lion's den, which we'll be doing shortly. This seems a more dramatic example of something not going wrong. You know, you think maybe you can get a lion who's friendly and not hungry or something, and whatever happens with that. But to actually put in a fire, that's a lot more miraculous. But then also it's a lot more ridiculous. So perhaps that's why it's not the story that's particularly used very much for that. But in the short version there anyway, Nebuchadnezzar is nuts, tries to kill Daniel. Daniel's virtuous, seems to be a particularly good dude actually, doesn't he? I think it does feel like the madness is going up a notch again at this stage. But it does also seem that Daniel might be one of the better people in the Old Testament actually. So they've all been deeply flawed. Daniel, though, doesn't seem to have any obvious big flaws yet so far. So on we will go anyway and see what he gets up to next.